and please use the panel, again, the question panel to ask questions, audience. Thank you. Holly, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you,
Great.
Evan. So as Evan said earlier, I'm the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the Delaware Valley Green Building Council. And I wanted to just expand on what Alex said about the role that we played in energy benchmarking in Philadelphia and how we can support benchmarking in other smaller municipalities and cities. And to give you a little background on DVGBC, we're the local chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council, although we are our own separate nonprofit organization with our own board and our own revenue. As you can see in the little map on the right-hand side of the slide, our region includes the 5-county metro Philly area, Lehigh and Northampton counties, and the state of Delaware. But there are also 2 other Green Building Council chapters in the rest of the state that cover the rest of Pennsylvania. DVGBC's mission is to promote green building practices, and our work now focuses on K-12 schools and policy. Our members come from a wide spectrum of the green building industry. We have architects and engineers, building trades and construction managers, energy service providers, and green product manufacturers. And so we represent many of the companies that represent the building energy efficiency market. DVGBC has been involved in the development and passage of the benchmarking legislation in Philly, and we continue to be involved in the outreach and education aspects. We were part of the group of advocates that put energy benchmarking on the list of legislative priorities for City Council over 2 years ago, and then we were asked by the city to help develop the sort of outside game before the legislation was introduced. So, as Alex mentioned earlier, together with ACA and Next Great City, we developed Coalition for an Energy Efficient Philadelphia, which was a group of over 100 businesses, nonprofits, and individuals who supported the energy benchmarking initiative and sort of pushed for it to move forward in Philly. We built the support, and then we hosted the public education session even before the legislation was introduced in City Council to help provide more understanding about the value of benchmarking and disclosure. And then as the legislation was introduced and hearings started to be held, our support translated into testimony, letters of support, and visits to City Council. And our members, as I mentioned, we have a lot of expertise, also provided some of that expertise to help develop the ordinance and the subsequent regulations. And now we're assisting the city in outreach and education around implementation of the ordinance. We've hosted numerous trainings with the city and with EPA, since Portfolio Manager is their tool, to help educate building owners and managers as well as energy service providers about the benchmarking ordinance, how it applies to them, what they have to do, as well as what they can use this data for in the future, how it's important, and how in addition to just complying with the law, how they can actually take this data and make it useful for them to save money and improve energy efficiency. Our outreach has primarily focused on a few sectors that we've had strong relationships with, which has been the education sector, hospitality sector. We're hosting Green Build this year. Some of you may know is a big conference in Philadelphia, and we have a relationship with a lot of the hotels here where Green Build attendees will be staying. So we work with them to help green their practices and help become more energy efficient and comply with the benchmarking law. We also started working with religious institutions. A number of parishes came to us because of all the work that we've been doing here, and they heard that we could help them with benchmarking, and so we've been working with them as well. And then we've worked with other partners like the Energy Efficient Buildings Hub in Philly to promote their benchmarking sessions. And as far as moving outside of Philly, we want to serve as a partner and a resource for efforts to expand energy benchmarking. We've already had discussions with some of the mayors in the Lehigh Valley where we have a strong core of volunteers, and they've expressed interest in pursuing energy benchmarking in addition to some other regions, some other municipalities that are in our region. DVGBC, though, is committed to using our experience here to help those other cities and smaller municipalities build support for benchmarking and hopefully to eventually pass a similar law. So we're here as a resource to help any of you that want to move forward in your territories, and we can also connect you with the other green building chapters in the state if your area is not part of our region. And then my contact information is at the bottom of the slide there. So if you have any questions afterwards that you think of, feel free to contact me. And I'll turn it back over to you, Evan.
Great, thanks, Holly. So I do have a couple questions here, and I think we can direct them at both Alex and Holly. But the question is, Philadelphia's benchmarking piece of legislation was a mandate required by law. So I guess what the question is getting at is if there are models or approaches that the panelists think will work that that are not necessarily mandates, but are somehow a function of competition or encouragement from business leaders, that kind of model. Maybe just I'll unmute the panelists and maybe let them offer up whatever they would want to say. Alex or Holly, can you answer to that?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of other good examples of voluntary programs. I think that a few to be aware of. There's the DOE Better Buildings Challenge, and one that I think has been a good model for us to look at before we had a mandate in place, but just when we were focused on benchmarking our own municipal facilities, is Arlington County in Virginia. So they have a whole suite of voluntary programs. One of the requirements, or one of the opportunities, is energy benchmarking for the private sector. They do have a requirement that municipal facilities are benchmarked, but they've done a lot of really interesting things with trying to incentivize sustainable behavior in the business sector. There are quite a few other cities that have challenge programs in place that have had, I think, varying levels of impact. And for our own purposes here in Philadelphia, the reason why we chose to go with the mandate approach is because there was such a dire need for us to reverse the trend of increased energy use. And just from past experience, working with a lot of great, very impactful voluntary programs, we knew that that wasn't going to be enough to turn the tide on that increase. And it is a requirement that all large commercial building owners benchmark, but again, this is not a requirement that is going to cost anyone money. There's no requirement to hire a consultant to do this. It can be done in-house, and in fact, we at the city level have benchmarked 300 facilities in-house with a really small staff. So we know that it's doable. We try to share that experience wherever we can, and we, along with our partners at the Delaware Valley Green Building Council and beyond, have been able to, as Holly said, support a lot of outreach and education sessions. And in the lead up to the final compliance deadline in November, we're going to be hosting office hours where anyone who is required to benchmark can bring in their information, and we will walk them through the process step by step. So I understand that mandates are not as palatable as voluntary challenges in a lot of locations, and I can understand why that's the case here in Philly, and I think in a lot of other places. It was not as controversial as you might anticipate when we were able to make the argument from the business case side that this really is something that is just a good management practice, doesn't require any investment on the part of the building owner, and is guaranteed to, at the very least, give you better information. Whether or not you choose to act on that information, totally up to you. This isn't about a performance requirement. It's just about getting everybody on the same page about what the responsibility is for the commercial sector to do a better job, since it is responsible for more than half of the building energy use in the city and greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I think that's a little bit our perspective. I can follow up afterwards with some of those details on voluntary programs that I've seen that I think are particularly well done and maybe good models to look at.
Great, Alex. Thank you. And yeah, I think in the city of Pittsburgh, we certainly have some sustainable business competitions, and the 2030 District Challenge that is embracing some of the things that are reminiscent of benchmarking. So, Holly, I guess a question for you would be, from the municipalities that are reaching out to you, is it from the lessons of the city of Philadelphia that they're seeing this as a positive policy step? Is there any specific talk of their motivation? Just accepted as good policy, economic reasons, an interested business district?
I think the primary reason would be economic, that they're looking to save money, and you can do that through promoting energy efficiency. I think they've been looking to Philly as a great example since we're close by, but also the other cities that have come before us and are now following after us. I think there's been 9 cities now in 2 states that have passed similar laws. also, and as you said, there's other voluntary programs as well. So it's sort of becoming best practice now, and I think that's why they're starting to consider it even more. There's a lot more growing interest in their areas for sustainable practices.
Great, thank you. We do have a question just about, and I think this would be directed back towards Alex again, about the cost of administering the program. And I guess I'd just add a little bit of fluff to the question. I know programs like Portfolio Manager and assistance from Department of Energy, certainly make executing this kind of program much easier than it would have been 5 years ago. But Alex, is there a lot of consideration with administration and the capacity to collect this data and manage it in a manner that is cost effective?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question to ask. So when you're contemplating this kind of thing, you have to have a good sense of where you stand in terms of the data that you need to administer the program before you can really get started. And every jurisdiction that I know of uses some form of tax data as their underlying source to establish which buildings will be required to comply. And that's certainly the case here in Philadelphia. We know our tax data is far from perfect, but when you're looking for something that's going to tell you about square footage in buildings and use type in buildings across the whole city, it's really the best thing that you have. And so far we've had pretty good experience with that. I will say that at the scale we're operating at, with more than 2,000 buildings, it is quite a bit of work to administer the program. So that is something to be mindful of. And while it may be cost neutral for the building owners who are participating, it's certainly something that is a big part of my job here in the Office of Sustainability. And there's an additional staff person that supports the work that I'm doing here full-time on energy benchmarking and disclosure. I think that from the experience of other cities, we know that a lot of the administrative hurdle in the first year is not the same in future years because there's less initial outreach, and the learning curve is quite steep in the first year, but people are familiar with it. And the way that Portfolio Manager works, really, once you set up a property and benchmarked your facility once, it's just about putting in that utility data in future years, and that's much less of a hurdle for folks who have done it once already before. So definitely is a time and resource cost involved with it. I don't know that I could put a dollar figure on that, but I do understand that, especially in some of the smaller jurisdictions where you may not have dedicated sustainability or energy staff, it presents a little bit more of a challenge. But I think that there are probably some interesting models from some of the voluntary programs that you can look into that might support getting something like this off the ground, whether it's phasing from a voluntary to a mandatory program and kind of collecting that information and phasing it in, scaling it up over time, or some other approach of aggregating jurisdictions and centralizing the administrative work. I think that it's absolutely possible. And if you think in any jurisdiction about what the structure of the government is, there's someone who's already working pretty extensively with that kind of building level information through the tax records. So it shouldn't be too much of a barrier, but it is something that you want to be sure you have a good sense of before you get started.
Great, thank you, Alex. One more question here, and it's maybe more of a point than a question, and I think both Alex and Holly raised this issue, but basically the point is can an administration or a local government really be in a position to mandate energy benchmarking if they haven't done a complete inventory and benchmark their own building stock? And I think the individual is making a point, but also maybe asking a question about the processes that a municipality would go through if this is something they're going to consider in the long run, and they haven't taken the steps to benchmark or do an inventory on their own, then certainly is lacking experience. So maybe just Holly and Alex just reiterate that would be an important step, or if you know of any models that those two things happen congruently or anything like that.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first, Holly. I think certainly any jurisdiction could choose to mandate it without doing it in their own buildings. I think that would be pretty unwise because it is important it certainly was important for us to be able to say, hey, we've already done this. We found it to be really valuable for our own building stock. We think it's a good tool for you to use too. And I know that politics are different everywhere you go, but certainly here people feel like if the city government can do it, anybody could probably pull it off in terms of doing something with building energy efficiency that requires a little bit of technical capacity. So that did go a long way for us. I think the other thing I would say is whether or not you're actually thinking about adopting a mandatory requirement, any jurisdiction can find value in using the portfolio manager tool because, again, it doesn't cost anything. And whatever your level of sophistication with energy use in your municipal facilities, this is something a little bit different because it's going to, again, compare your buildings to this national database of properties and give you a sense of how you're performing relative to that data set of peer buildings rather than just against your own buildings. And here in Philly, over the last couple of years, we invested in a pretty sophisticated utility bill management system so that we can track energy use and cost by facility in much more detail than we were ever able to before. And that's one piece of the management tool, but also getting that snapshot of what that means on in a different context and a national perspective is really valuable. So a lot of those third-party tools, utility bill management tools like the one that I'm referencing that we use here in Philly, they interface directly with Portfolio Manager. So it may be easier than you even would suspect depending on what kind of process you have in place for managing municipal energy use.
And just to add on to that, I agree with Alex that I think it'll make any sort of mandate or even voluntary standard a lot more palatable to the people that you're trying to get to comply with it. If you can say the city has done it too, we know what it's like to go through it, and we can help you because of that. I think it will give the staff or whoever's trying to support the ordinance or the standard more knowledge of what is going on, what they have to do, and the ability to tell people this is how it will help you if you can do this, if you can benchmark. So.
That's right, and I think the sooner you can get started with that so that you have some experience with it for 1 or 2 years prior to introducing a policy change, you can talk about not only what your experience was like doing the work of benchmarking, but also how you used it to evaluate your portfolio and make changes to your buildings, why it's a good management tool. Mm-hmm. And you don't, I think that we have leaned very heavily on a lot of private sector partners who have done that too, because it's one thing to hear it coming from government, and I know Holly has been in the room where we've been doing trainings together where we can tell them about how great portfolio manager is, give an audience about why it's really a great management tool, and if they then hear it from one of their peers, one of their competitors, it means a lot more than if it's coming from the advocate for this issue.
A good question for you, Caroline, because we have representatives here on the line that are interested in learning from the leaders, the Pennsylvania leaders like Philadelphia. For them, though, considering their small jurisdiction, what's going to be the benefit for them getting out in front? What is going to be the benefit for the first municipality under 100,000 people that says we have benchmarking? What is, what's that motivation, and what's that, what are those early adopter benefits?
Sure. So, there are a number of small and medium-sized cities that are sort of trying to figure out how this makes sense for them and how to scale it and how to manage it, that kind of thing. We're seeing a lot of good support coming out of the national landscape to help, make this an easier task. The city database, for example, I don't know if you guys touched on that or not, but some other things. So it's going to become an easier thing soon, I think, and I think we're going to see the first domino of the small and medium cities here fall pretty soon, and then, hopefully more will see that it's, something very manageable, and that, that that's something that they want to do as well. In terms of being the first adopter, you get the gold star of being the first one to do it, to set the example for everybody else. which is a pretty big point of pride, I think, for a lot of people. But certainly when you are the first to do something like this, you're forging new ground, so there's always going to be unforeseen challenges and things that we learn and see along the way that other folks then get the privilege of learning from. This is something that we think makes really practical sense for any city that wants better understanding of their building stock, that wants to catalyze energy efficiency through market action and not through, requirements, who wants to see rebate and incentive programs take a better foothold. And they want to get on the map for being innovative. I think that's a motivation as well for a lot of folks. So there are certainly benefits. And I do think that, it's a couple of questions to consider, I think, for smaller places. One, if you're focusing on the commercial sector, which most of these policies are, you need to look at your commercial sector. It is true that, many small cities have a significant commercial sector, and that this will have an impact on a significant portion of their building stock. There are some small cities that don't have much of a commercial center. Maybe the commercial center is outside of their city limits, so their jurisdiction over that isn't there. So then maybe it's a slightly different program. Maybe the threshold goes down lower, or maybe we need to think more about residential programs. There's a lot of questions to be asked, I think. We've seen multifamily be included in a lot of these policies, and in some policies we've seen multifamily excluded. I think a lot of that usually has to do with whether the utility is able to provide the data, because it's certainly not something really realistic to expect a residential tenant to go door to door asking grandma for their energy bills for the last 12 months. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. There are a lot of questions to be asked, a lot of people trying to figure out how to do it, make it work, and make it make sense. But every city is unique, so these policies are not one size fits all. Sometimes these policies may not even be the best fit for somebody, but I think they can be tailored and shaped to be efficient, to be effective in most places that would be interested in something like this. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. Well, that concludes our webinar for this afternoon. I'd like to thank our panelists, Alex, Holly, and Caroline, for their insights. And I invite and thank you to the attendees for taking time out of your afternoon to learn about benchmarking and pick up some of the insights from the speakers. I invite each of you to really sit down and consider how a policy like this could improve your community. And please reach out to us with any needs or requests for resources. We at Penn Future are here to help, and I know specifically Holly at Delaware Green Building is also available for communities in their jurisdiction. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.